Greetings, everybody, and welcome back to another installment of the Healing Brothers podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Brandon Jones, and I'm with the legendary Sam Simmons. How are you doing on this lovely Sunday, Sam?
I'm fine. I'm not gonna get too deep today on how I feel about too much, I guess, until we,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I never, even when I say that, I don't even know why I say that because I'm gonna get deeper anyway,
Right.
man. But I ran into somebody.
Okay.
I was doing a training uh earlier this week, and a young lady walked into the training. They introduced me, and she, as often happens, she really was trying to figure out, well, who is this man,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so what happened was that she sat there for a minute and she listened to me. And she says, "You're Sam Simmons." I said, "Yeah, that's what we said. Uh, you be on a podcast with Brandon Jones, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I be watching y'all." She said, "You out there?" I said, I'm tame the Brandon. Nah, you are out there. Brandon be sitting there listening and taking it all in, but you don't care what you say, do you?" It's like I said, "Did you disagree with something I said?" She said, "No, I didn't disagree with it, but you a piece of work." I said, "Oh, okay." And I'm thinking all the time, you the radical one. It's like, man, put me in my place.
you just never know how people interpret things,
Hey, I just know that girlfriend was like, when she figured out I was that Sam Simmons, her whole posture changed in the meeting, in the training. She started leaning forward and sitting up, and it's like, oh, I might learn something up in this bad boy. It's like, which tells you, and I keep trying to tell folks, young folks pay attention,
Right.
and if you ain't talking some real stuff, they ain't got no time for you. They might
Right.
they might not be disrespectful, because she wasn't disrespectful. She was just sitting there, but her whole demeanor changed. It's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, which is been good for me. I mean, yeah, I often tell people, due to my trauma, um, I yeah, due to my trauma, uh, I don't always respond to compliments quickly,
Sure.
or in sometimes not even appropriately, according to other folks, right? But yeah, it's been wild. I had a professor from Mankato University uh, contact me, want me to come to Mankato University and talk to their healthcare uh, students about disparities and that kind of thing, and spend part of a day with them. And
Mm-hmm.
when people send out emails, I always like to talk to them first, because you got to find out what they really want, right?
Right.
And there's certain things I don't do, right, which always surprises them when you tell them, no, I don't do that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they have their idea of how they. It's interesting. They want to do disparities and all the other kind of stuff, then they want to tell you how they want to do it,
Right.
and it's like, I don't play that,
Right.
right? And the dude, I said, okay. I said, so why did you contact me? He says, well, I asked somebody, is there anybody to come in and talk about historical trauma, and that effect on healthcare and that kind of stuff. And every place I checked around the state, they said, you need to start with me. We'll start with Mr. Simmons.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh, okay. Uh, Maybe I am a little special. you know, you know, you know, special from a little, the little version, because when we start talking about people special, then they start, you know, getting into all kind of other crazy stuff.
Yeah. Right, right.
But that's been my week. I did my second, oh no, my third in-person presentation this week, and got me out the basement. People didn't think they could get me out the basement,
He lives.
right? So I guess it's been an interesting week. My barber, went to see my barber. I got a little trim. My beard ain't as flat, and he was telling me that because my barber is inside of a beauty shop, which is interesting. Sitting there
Mhm,
getting your hair cut in the middle of the beauty shop and listening
mhm,
to those conversations is some
mhm,
interesting stuff. But he was in there, and some of the women who come to beauty shop know me, right?
mhm.
And they got to talking about, yeah, that's Sam, man. He's down there in the basement in his underwear making money. It's like I was like, hey man. And he said the woman that he was talking with, actually your former boss gets her hair done there,
Okay.
right? And yeah, she said, I know. That's Sam, and actually he's probably happy down there in his underwear and a shirt. Knowing him, we might not even be underwear, but it was some wild stuff. But that's been my week, reported by everybody else.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, part of that's joke, but part of it, there's a little truth in there. Is we've hit a point in time in history where people can make a living from their living room or their basement or from their couch or whatever, and that's where we're at. One of the biggest commodities we have as a nation is information, and I think the way that the young woman that you were talking about who recognized you from the podcast is that's our generation, my generation, and behind us, information is important. And I think the difference between my generation, Generation X, and the boomers is that your sources of information only came from a few channels, where my generation has been exposed to, we can't go and find information ourselves. It's not just the TV or the radio or a few magazines. We can go on various different social media, we can literally Google any word, and there's so many different alternative views and things. So I'm not surprised that she leaned in, because she's watched this podcast and something has resonated with her, enough for her to recognize you. So that's where we're at, and I think that more content creators are going to be needed, and especially for a topic like what we're going to cover today with resiliency. There are a lot of people talking about how they've been resilient on an individual level, but from a communal level, what does that really look like? And we need more people to share their stories, but it can't just stop there. One thing that me and you've talked about a lot, and you opened my eyes to, is a lot of people have stories, and they've built livings off of that one story.
Right.
And how far does that one story go before it helps another person or a collective group of people? I think a lot of people get stuck there. So there is this kind of filtering of the BS from actual substance. And I think that's why a lot of people gravitate towards you, is because you just kind of give it to people straight. But then there's also strategy. It's not just this is what it is and you should just deal with it. It's like, okay, how do you function differently? These are some things for you to think about and consider to function differently. I think that's important. So with that stated, let's dive into the topic of resiliency.
Yeah.
What is resiliency to you? When you hear that term, I mean, you've been working in this space for quite some time, and I'm sure it's come up in many different ways. But when you think of resiliency, what do you consider?
Well, um, it's when I think of resiliency, is I think if you look at the definition about bouncing back and that kind of thing, um, my experience with resiliency has not always been positive,
Mm-hmm.
right? What I mean by that is we didn't talk about a resiliency in my family, but I heard more about it once I started doing this trauma work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's been used against uh, me in ways where it was to shut me down,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because because we, as in a community, we talk about being resilient people, and how far we've come from our, especially if you got American slavery or chattel slavery in your background, how far we come in spite of all this,
Right.
uh, starting with the slavery and then being followed by oppression and institutional racism, and still, you know, um, we're here, right?
Right.
And when I think of resiliency, at least from uh, uh, um, probably generations back, it was not only are we here, but we're thriving in spite of the experience. And I think the thriving part has gotten lost in when we talk about resiliency now, right? And one of the things is that when one of the things when you talk about trauma becomes a major problem when you get stuck. And I think parts of our community is very stuck in its trauma, and part of it is our trauma experience has been so unique that, in terms of surviving the trauma, we built a life around trauma,
Right.
right? And even a culture around trauma, to the point where it even makes us more stuck, and so back to the question about resiliency, is I see resiliency in a positive sense, is we bounce back and we thrive, not just that we bounce back, right? And as I mentioned, I think the thriving part has gotten lost in that, and we don't talk in depth. See, we're kind of, and we're not the only ones that do this, but we like to throw out words and then move on. It's like the preacher throwing out a scripture and talking about 4 days on that scripture, right? And we'll thought you can do a sermon around resiliency. I know I'm gonna get in trouble. I could do a sermon
It's
about
Sunday.
huh?
You good? It's Sunday.
I
You
know,
good?
we're resilient, brother. Say amen to resiliency. Yes, say amen. It's like, we still here. They cannot take us from here. Amen. In spite of that, we still dress better than them. Amen. No,
And
amen.
still I rise. That is the African American proverb. The African American proverb. And still I rise.
And brother, black don't crack, but but we make great looking corpses. I'm sorry. That was my part of the sermon. Amen. So one of my practices in doing my groups is I can do a group off of resiliency, almost like a pastor, right? But the piece is the sermon gets led by the clients, right? It's like, we're going to talk about resiliency. What does resiliency mean to you, church? And you'll learn a lot about people if you let one in, and you tell them there is no wrong answer. This is your answer. Because I'll get the clients, we're resilient. Well, I don't know how to say it. Just say it. Now, does it mean that some of the stuff they say is kind of out to lunch? Yeah, it does sound that way. But then if you dig through it further and start finding the roots of that conversation, you learn a lot about that person's experience in their life. You know what I'm saying? And so I think at times we have done this because we don't want to get deep. We have done folks a real injustice by throwing out words and not really asking them, do you know what we mean? Because I think some folks don't even know what they mean when they throw out the words. It just sound good. Because there's certain words, right, that work. And even some of the ridiculous white folks use the same words when they're talking to us. You could be a racist, but now you want to quote Martin Luther King and want to step past the fact that his last sermon in his pocket said that America is on the cups of going to hell. See, people
Mhm.
people don't want to hear about that, right? We want to talk about, he was about peace, and I don't know why you people acting up and all that. Well, he had a conversation about that too, So you can use words and plug them in the spots and make them sound like anything. But what do they mean to you? It's just like when you ask me, what does resiliency mean? That is the process. You start with that. You don't come in dictating to people what it should mean
Right.
or assume they know what you mean unless you're trying to get them, because then once you figure out where they're at, now you can walk them to a different look. You give them a different look. You don't, you try your best not to criticize them. I mean, I try hard, but see, when I get some really crazy shit that come out of people's mouths, it's like, oh, do you really believe that? And even they start laughing. I mean, where'd you hear that at? Like, you know, and because our in parts of our community we're very emotionally fragile,
Right.
right? To the point
Mhm.
where we will over respond to people's opinions before we even let their opinions come out, because we think they're getting ready to tell us there's something wrong. It's like, wait a minute,
Right.
let me finish, right? Because we're always ready to fight. We're always ready to have a comeback, and we ain't talking, because that's why I think that all comes from out the dozens. That's the style of our comedy. We always want to have a comeback,
Mm.
and when you're spending all your time thinking about a comeback, you ain't listening to what's going on.
Right.
And now you have an inappropriate comeback, and then you want somebody to feel sorry for you when you got to pay a price for that inappropriate comeback, right?
Right.
And so young man, what does resiliency mean to you?
For me, resiliency is similar to how you've laid it out. It is the ability to come back from an adversity or a challenging moment in time or period of time. But it's also, for me, and this is where I differ from a few other folks, it's the ability to function given that that situation has happened, right? It's your ability to try to avoid having those types of things happen again, but being able to move past the situation. Don't let it captivate you or harm you even further. And honestly, I think one of the biggest things around resiliency is not identifying with the harm or hurt that happened. And that can be very challenging for people. And we're keeping this more in the context of Black folks, but we don't identify ourselves as slaves. We don't identify ourselves as Negroes. When things happen, intergenerational trauma, we don't identify ourselves with being sexual abuse victims. Now, we might call ourselves survivors and things of that nature, but it's the important thing is to kind of reclaim yourself as part of this resiliency that I think that is important. And just from a counseling standpoint, many people struggle to move past that because they haven't figured out how to kind of reclaim themselves or to redefine who they are, given that the awful thing has already taken place. I think that's an important part of resiliency. And I think collectively as a community, and you mentioned earlier, we're stuck, and I agree with that. I think one of the reasons why is that we found benefits within being identified with being the victim of the system, which we are victims of the system. But at the same time, we can't stay stuck there, because if you stay stuck in a victim position, that's how everyone will relate to you. That's how you will operate from your own standpoint. And then things never get better. You just stay stuck in this kind of route. And I feel like at some point we have to accept what has happened, but also figure out a way to move forward, given that it has taken place. And that doesn't mean that we ignore it or we avoid it or anything like that. It's just we can't change anything. We can't change what took place. And for us to be resilient collectively, we have to function in a way that does not connect us back to the old trauma. So I don't know if that makes any sense. I probably have to go a little deeper to clear it up a little bit. But I just feel like collectively, when we think that we're resilient, we have sayings and ideas around us being resilient, but we haven't really moved socially. We haven't moved very far from where we once were, and I think that that's one of our struggles.
Yeah, and give an example of that is that I remember a young man who started my group, and and one of the things that happened is he was telling me this story of his grandmother, and I actually tell this story periodically when I go out and speak and I talk about my men's group, and we do stuff around trauma in my men's group,
Mhm.
and we're developing even better stuff too. And the young man was telling us a story that he lives with his grandmother, right?
Mhm.
I think he's in his mid-20s. It was in his mid-20s, and he was getting ready to leave the house, right? And his grandmother started noticing that he consistently would get ready to leave the house on a Tuesday evening, right?
Mhm.
And this was unusual for him because consistency wasn't his best suit. Even she knew that, right? And she didn't have to tell him or anything else, remind him or none of that. And so she said, "Where are you going? Where you been going on Tuesdays over the last several weeks?" And he says, "Well, I've been going to Mr. Sam's group. It's actually a different name what it called, but I'm going to Mr. Sam's group." Well, who's this Mr. Sam? Well, he the guy who run the group. And what do y'all talk about in that group? He says, "We talk about trauma and stress." She said, "Trauma? Y'all talk about trauma?" He said, "Yeah." He says, "Why is that man being so negative? Because
Right.
we resilient people." And you tell him that he gotta quit that negative stuff because we're resilient people. You go back and you tell that man that. So he come back to group, and we're doing a check-in, and he's just laughing. He said, "My grandmama told me to tell you to quit talking about this trauma stuff because we're resilient people." Now, what am I gonna say about a grandma, right?
Right. You can't say
You
nothing
know,
bad.
I mean, that's a setup. People use
Right.
that grandma thing on you, like, even though, I'm oldest Methuselah, that kind of thing. But what am I gonna say, right? And so I said, "Well, you go back and you tell your grandma, uh, um, thank you, thank you very much, okay? But tell me, what does resiliency mean to you?"
Mhm.
And he said, "Resiliency is we're like roaches. We're not going nowhere, you know." And it's like, okay. So basically, because we still exist, we're resilient. Yeah, that's what I said.
Mhm.
I said, "Oh my God." And then we finished and had a long conversation about resiliency. But he basically was just talking about surviving, not thriving, surviving. you
Mm.
know. And on top of that, to tell you where he's getting his education from, that's a comedy routine.
Sure.
That's part
Yeah.
of a comedy routine,
Mhm.
right? And the ironic part is that's the way he was living his life, because that's why he was in
Right.
my group,
Right.
living in the moment. I get mine, you get yours, maybe. So, so that type of view of resiliency is a recipe uh, 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 for some really negative outcomes.
Right.
Even if you ain't looking for those negative outcomes, right? I'm living in the moment. And then you want to wonder why, our community, because we always like to. It's bizarre to me how, as a community, we spend too much damn time comparing ourselves to other people
Mhm.
with the and other people's experiences, and just disregard, or in some cases not even disregard, and on the next breath talk about how unique our experience is than other
Right.
people. How do you compare yourself to other people? And usually it's in a negative way, right? And at the same time, do you really realize? Because we say shit and don't even believe it or don't even have a full understanding of it, right? So we waste time comparing ourselves to other cultures who are immigrants, right? Mm-hmm. We compare ourselves to America's response to us to other people. America's response to us has been different, continues to be different. Even if it's not, in some cases, not even deliberately different, it ends up being different because of the way America has responded to us, and how America was built on our mistreatment, right? And so, so you have a part of us that have gotten into this thing about, we're resilient, and long as we stick in there, God will see us through.
Mm-hmm.
When do you start thinking about your part, your activity,
right?
Your efforts to thrive. Staying stuck is not thriving.
Right.
Staying stuck in the old ideals is not thriving. Now, them old ideals, the sad part about it, see, the thing is those old ideals helped us in the past. But when you don't evolve, you can't thrive.
Right.
Right. And on top of that, sometimes we don't even really understand where some of them old ideals, where they really came from. Mm-hmm. And they were trauma responses. That's where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get the old folks that are back in the day, back in the day, we were a community. Well, back in the day, you couldn't move. How about that?
Mm.
Back in the day, we had contained neighborhoods. What about that?
Right.
And soon as the door opened, what did we do? Let's talk about that part. Folks who could move out, hurry up and moved out.
A lot of people left.
Yes. And we still get people who respond, well, we got to come together so we can save our children's lives. Okay. You wait on that. You wait on that coming together. I'm going to do some other stuff, but you wait on that, dude. Right? So we're going to wait on the other broken folks to help the other broken folks. And I know that sounds cold. That brother calling us broken. Well, some of us are. And it ain't. And again, I don't see it as our fault, but it's our responsibility to do something about the brokenness. Right? So you ain't gonna get me to sit here and talk about the unfairness and the oppression within the system. See, folks like to get you caught up, right? They want to do that all or nothing. So you saying this and this and this, so you letting the system out. No, man, I just ain't focused on the system like you are. There's a whole bunch of folks focused on the system, but there ain't enough of us focused on healing.
Right.
And a certain amount of responsibility for our healing.
Right.
And part of that is getting a better understanding. Right. Well, all we got to do is I love this one. All you got to do is put your mind to it and you can heal. I was like, oh God. It's the same thing. All you got to do is put your mind to it and we can change.
I got a better one for you.
What?
All we got to do is come together. That's what I keep hearing.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. Even Martin Luther King knew better than that. Since you want to talk about Martin Luther King, shoot, man, if Martin Luther King waited for us to all believe in what he believed in, there wouldn't have been no Martin Luther King.
Mm.
I mean, because you had Martin Luther King and you have Malcolm X, right? That's the one. Them are the two we kind of look as the bookmarks of the age, right? Both of them came closer together as they got a better understanding. They didn't stay stagnant. And the more they came closer together, the more they needed to be dead. And that's not just because of the system. Okay, because we weren't all that kumbaya to start with. My daddy used to say, "Won't that Negro leave them white people alone and bring his ass on up north and get a job?" That's what he said about Martin Luther King. He wasn't the only one who said it, because that's why he was up north. These white folks up here ain't perfect, but they ain't hanging me in no damn tree. Okay, at least not right now. Although it don't, hey, shoot, I done been up in northern Minnesota. And I don't know, because we yeah, yeah, I mean, yeah, but yeah. So back to resiliency. Educate me, professor. I'm just a poor little old black man, with a piece of an education. I don't know nothing.
Well, resiliency is about being able to return to a form, being able to get from where you once were. Well, you were at a particular place at one point in time. Something happened, some sort of adversity, some sort of trauma, trouble showed up, and then you're overcoming that particular issue and you're springing back to where you were before. Now, that's the traditional idea and concept of resiliency. I think that for Black folks, I question if that is even something that is possible for Black Americans, is to go back to something that we were before we felt the trauma of racism, white supremacy, to the extent where we were enslaved on the continent. We lost the war. We prisoners of war, got sold, went through the Mayafa, traveled to this hemisphere, got dropped off in South America and the islands in North America. And for us that had a lineage here in North America, end up becoming enslaved Africans, which later morphed into what we know as Negroes. What position in any of that can we go back to? I think that even talking about being resilient people doesn't even make sense from the definition of the term, because we don't have something to return to that did not involve trauma. So for us to heal, we have to move forward. It's not about returning or bouncing back. It's about adjusting and moving forward. Like you said, thriving. And we have the crazy part about all this, even though we know the system's still messed up, there's still a lot of things that need to be worked on. This might be the best opportunity we have to make the most of ourselves. But we don't think about it like that because we stay stuck in the victim stamp, the victim zone. It's like yes, we have been victims. Yes, white supremacy does affect our lives on a consistent basis, but it ain't the same that it was for your parents. Hell, even for you to a certain extent. It's not the same situation when you were growing up as it is today. There's a lot of more opportunity for us, and that's been proven on a consistent basis from other ethnic groups that come here, and then they judge us. They judge our culture, they judge our actions, because they're like, how are you all not making it in this country? We literally just seen this was that last week? Yeah, last week, with all these Afghani males mostly, but all these Afghani people who are literally they hopped on planes, holding up for dear life to just make it out of their country. A lot of them, they're attempting to get here to the United States because they know that this country gives them an opportunity that's different from where they're at. So people come here and they look at us like, what the hell is wrong with you Black Americans? You are in one of the best places to make it in this society, yet you don't. And then they realize, oh, this is how it works here. We can capitalize off of their dysfunction and off of their inability to organize as a community. So let's open up a gas station. Let's open up a restaurant. Let's open up all these businesses because they ain't doing it. So we'll do it instead.
Yeah, the thing is we do have to put some nuance on that, my brother.
Let's do it.
There is some nuance on that. I mean, there is an extra layer when it comes to us around that kind of stuff, right? So I don't want no folks to think that we don't know there's an extra layer, right?
Let's talk about the extra layer.
yeah. But some people want to stay stuck in the extra layer, right?
Yes.
because people often talk about the services that immigrants get when they first come here, and
Mhm.
they are they're set
Mhm.
up, but at the same time, some of them services was set up for us early in the process,
Mhm.
right? And some of us took advantage of it, and some of us didn't. But the interesting thing when you talk about that immigrant, what the immigrant don't figure out until later, that they only let them open up businesses in certain neighborhoods,
Mhm.
right? They only
This is
let them
true.
open up businesses in certain neighborhoods, right? That's why look at our corner stores.
Mhm.
It's like it's still a kind of a redlining for your small business.
Right.
You know, but you're right. They come in, but again, when you're looking at immigrants, though, again back to that unique experience as Black people,
Yep.
immigrants come here with a plan.
Right. Correct.
We didn't come here with no plan.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, emotionally, part of us are still stuck in when y'all gonna say y'all sorry and when y'all gonna be nice to us, right? Because
Right.
that's a trauma response too,
Right. Absolutely.
and that's where the stuckness come in. So we cannot ignore history, but that don't mean we supposed to be stuck in that history.
Right.
And we cannot, and when we think about history, we have to also think about history and how does it show up today and what kind of adjustments we need to make to learn from that history, right?
Mhm.
And it's hard to learn from a history when when you reject one of the outcomes of that history,
Mhm.
the trauma, and what has
Mhm.
it had an effect on us,
Right.
right? Because we'll talk about the history, you know, about yeah, man, back in the day they dressed like this. Well, that they were motivated by stereotypes, right? We have to outlive stereotypes, right? And that motivated our dress, and motivated a lot of our responses to the world that hasn't always evolved, right?
Mhm.
you know Again, when you talk about earlier working from a victim position, um there was a time that worked for certain people.
Mhm.
you know I mean, when you deem one group a victim and one group a perpetrator, that's an easy fight.
Right.
But when that gets nuanced and get cloudy, who is the perpetrator, right? The perpetrator. So how do you deal with the perpetrator who is in your midst?
Right.
Then who's the victim then?
Right.
Because unfortunately, when you're dealing with a perpetrator in your midst, that perpetrator can be both victim and perpetrator at the same time.
Right. Mhm.
So that's the problem with that all or nothing kind of response, that we um accuse other people of doing to us that we do to ourselves
Right.
in a real interesting way. And one of the things I wanted to respond to you
Mhm.
when you was talking about the resiliency of returning back to,
Yep.
um, I had that conversation with a young man, right? And in my day, I grew up in a highly religious home with a lot of rules, a lot of things you couldn't do. It's interesting. Sometimes you got a lot of rules. There's a lot of rules of things you can't do,
Mhm.
right? And not enough information on things you can, right? Which is unfortunate. And once I got older, broke away from the church, I decided to live a more exciting life. And for a short period of time, I sold drugs, mistreated women, did a lot of things that I've done. Luckily, I probably should regret. I regret them, but I don't stay stuck in that regret,
Right.
because that's a bad place to be stuck. um and I tell those stories, right? I'm not proud of them, but let folks know where I came from the church, which was not a pleasant experience either, right? So we end up, for one unpleasant experience building another unpleasant experience, although it was fun in the short term, or at least felt that way because it was different. That's the only thing that made it fun. And then doing the stuff I'm doing now. And I tell that story. And a young man came up to me and he says, Mr. Simmons, I listened to your story. I really admire your story. You did all these things and you turned yourself around and I think I can do that. What comments you have for me? I said, well, first of all, let's talk about your life. And I said, this is why we talk about have you focus on your life, your experience, and your trauma experience. Okay, because all of that stuff can have an effect on choices you make, right? Mm-hmm. I said, the difference between me and you is I came up in the church. You came up in the street from a little kid, mm-hmm. right? I mean, if we look at your life and all the trauma that you experienced, even as a kid, I really shouldn't even talk about my experience because my experience wasn't that, if you balance them on the paper, why am I complaining, right? And I don't like, comparing people's trauma because everybody's different and we're at a different space, right? But still, if we look at that, I said, when we talk about things like recovery, because recovery fits in that resilience, right? Recover to what?
Right. Exactly.
What do you go back to? I came up in the church, right? So there was a certain amount of, even though the people in the church weren't that nice, I still had a foundation of values that I could go back to at least to kind of sort them out for myself. Mm-hmm. What do you go back to? I said, so your transition is going to be a little bit more difficult because now you got to do, you might have to do a lot of brand new stuff.
Right.
That are uncomfortable and damn right scary.
Yeah, but necessary.
And you're going to have to be brave enough to do that. And that might mean that you might have to introduce yourself to some people outside of your norm, outside of your family, and maybe outside of your community. I just want you to be aware of that. And so that I mean, again, that's coming from understanding our unique circumstance. See, we talk a good, like I said, we talk a good game, but we really need to really address and understand our unique circumstance, right? One of the things, and they probably, because of their position here in America, Native Americans are really, they might not be doing it perfectly from other people, but they're really taking hold of their unique circumstance.
Right. And their cultural healing response.
Right.
It's very important. Yeah.
But again, their cultural healing response was their culture.
Right. Something to return to.
Right. Something to return to. Right. Now, they know they got to make adjustments for the modern day. Right. But their experience is uniquely different than other Americans. Right. And they've learned not to be bashful about that.
Yep.
Right. They were the quiet minority. Right. And we can learn from that. Mm. Even though our situation is different, our uniqueness, we always want to brag about our uniqueness, but we got to take in the full breath of our uniqueness as a way to, I don't know if the word is recover. I don't think it's the right word, but evolve, to thrive. We have a unique opportunity to develop a culture that, and this shouldn't be our goal, but it can happen, that other people envy. other people envy our creativity and all
Yeah.
these other things that entertain them. But think about really holding on. I mean, really getting a handle on our unique experience as African Americans with American chattel slavery in our background, right? But we have historically tried to avoid that unique experience. At the same time, talk about how unique the experience and
Right.
go back. And I have no problem going back to the continent, but that you cannot ignore this experience and the uniqueness, and not only the uniqueness, but at the same time, uh the opportunity of learning that came out that experience, right?
Right.
We
Right.
got to do both,
Yeah.
because there's the big thing, and you see it more and more about, instead of looking at soul food as negative, looking at it in a real positive sense. I think there's something on
Hmm.
Netflix about that, and
Hmm.
the cultural food and all like that. And it is not an all or nothing, but we cannot ignore the unique human story that includes working through this trauma
Right.
to get to the other side, right? And so, because again, we started this conversation talking about resiliency, but the resiliency in our community has weakened
Mm.
because we have not been able to
Evolve.
move to thriving,
Right.
right? you know, uh, uh, um, the resiliency was, in spite of how you treat us, we still thrive, right?
Right.
You know, and that's where that work twice as hard as our counterpart come from, right?
Right.
You said we didn't know how to we didn't know how to read and write, and we're too stupid to learn how to read and write, and then so we go to school and we get straight A's and become doctors,
Yeah.
right? And that's why I think the probably one of the unique things that come out of historical Black colleges. Statistically, majority of our Black doctors, Black lawyers, uh, Black businessmen come out of, over 50% of them come out of historically Black
HBCUs.
schools,
Hmm. Which is amazing.
right? Especially with the limited amount of funding.
Right.
But at the same time, we got this other culture that comes out of that ends up showing up there too, that we have to deal with at the same time, right?
Hmm.
Because we know, because and so we so that resiliency piece, the weakness part of it is deeper than we are just surviving.
Hmm.
Okay. And that's like moment to moment, minute to minute,
Hmm.
you know. And when you're stuck in surviving, it's hard to look at what does it mean to thrive. It's hard to
Right.
see that
Right.
in an environment that is just surviving all around you, right? And so yeah.
So let's spend the last few minutes talking about what does this thriving look like? What is it? What's a part of this for us collectively? Individuals may have their own subjective needs and desires for moving forward, evolving, but collectively, what are some of the things that you think are needed for us to move forward? I'll give a few of my answers while you kind of think about it, and then we'll let you round us out for the rest of today's conversation. So, and we've had these talks for quite some time, and I've put some thought into what I think goes into resiliency. I think one of the first things is we have to be honest about what we've been through and what we're currently going through, and not being afraid or have shame or even guilt in some of the things that we've experienced. I think that quote unquote owning that or accepting it, sometimes even just stating it or knowing what it is very important for this healing journey and for us to evolve as a collective. I think also we have to be intentional about what we want our future to look like. A lot of times and this is more from a counseling standpoint, but a lot of times I have had conversations with people who have these very fantasy like ideas of what they want. They don't really see themselves, and it's just like it'd be nice if this would happen in my life, and they leave everything up to chance. And it's like, well, some things you do have that some things you can actually achieve if you put some steps in place now to get to that level or get to that space. But a lot of people just see it so far out of their reach that it's just a good idea. It's like almost winning the lottery. Like, yeah, you may never win the lottery, but you got to at least buy a lottery ticket to try. Like some people just don't do nothing. So I think that, being intentional with our actions, and having a some sort of idea of what you want in the future is very important. And then the last thing, that I would say is important for this resiliency is not being afraid to have to experience new things, or get outside of your comfort zone, so to say. Many Black folks, we just stay in our little bubbles, man. We don't get out. We think that other things that people do are, it's about their culture. It's not about the experience. So it's like, oh, I ain't going kayaking. That's what white folks do. It's like that might be one of the best things you might do for yourself, like to just get out and try something different. But we stay stuck in what we think is cool or culturally acceptable. And I think that the more experiences we can have, the more things that we can do, the better we are, because you learn things about yourself and about the world when you get outside of your bubbles. And I just see so many Black folks who just stay stuck in our bubbles all the time. And when I managed programs at North Point, we had all these great ideas of things we wanted to get the youth to do. And a lot of times, Sam, it wasn't even the youth that were like, "No, nah, I ain't doing that." It was their parents. It's like, damn, we're trying to give your kid opportunities to try something different or go to a new place, but the parents had so much concern or fear, or the caregiver had so much concern or fear that they wouldn't even allow sometimes the young person to do stuff. But it's just like, they trusted us with their children, but it was like the thing we were doing, like camping. They're like, "Nah, we ain't doing that." And it's like, man, at some point you got to get these young men out of their environment, so that they can just think different or be somewhere and have just a different experience where they don't feel like they are trying to protect themselves 24/7. So it's important for us to have different experiences, be honest about what we do, and actually have a plan for the future, and don't be afraid to just experience different things to get there. So that's my long answer to what resiliency looks like in the community for us to move forward. What do you think?
Well, I don't know how much more I can add, but we need to work at it, having better insight. Ask
Mhm.
us questions. And be willing to deal with honest answers. Right. If we sense we know something is wrong, right, we cannot deny it, but we want to know what's going on. I mean, we know things are happening to us all around us, and we got to be willing and curious enough to ask for additional questions outside of our normal area, right? There's nothing wrong with not knowing. What's wrong is when you don't ask the question and let folks know that I don't know. You ain't gonna learn no other way. Independence. You might have to learn some. That's a tough one for us because we're very codependent folks, and that means we might have to develop some emotional and physical distance from some folks or some problems that we are confronted with. Developing relationships that are ties with folks that is mutually respectful, mutually respectful. You was talking about the creativity or lack of creativity of the young people's parents. Well, they're scared, but we have to challenge that. You know, uh, uh, we have to stretch ourselves, and not just see ourselves as victims, but take control over the pieces that we can actually have some control over. you know you want to try. I get these guys, they want to, it's really about a thought process. Again, that resiliency that we was thinking about in our ancestors' day, especially those who recently got out of slavery, was in spite of all these bad things you said about us, we thrived anyway. Now we are at that level that we have to move to getting you at least to that level and more. But again, it's really about a sense of being able to be creative, even if it's outside of our usual norms. Really finding a moral code in our life that might not necessarily be attached to the church, right? And so it's a quality of living. It's got to be based around a quality of survival, and most of all is if this ideal resiliency, am I doing better? Right? Am I being willing to continually learn, being willing to be continually challenged, right? And learning ain't always got to be out of a book, but you want to have more. And as parents, be willing to support our children's curiosity, even when it's uncomfortable to us. So yeah, and not reject our full uniqueness, not just in terms of the things we've created out of the dust, but our full uniqueness in terms of the type of trauma and experience that we have dealt with, that which calls for some unique responses, and not the responses given to us by external people. So I don't know if any of that made sense, but
Absolutely.
yeah.
It made sense to me. I mean, we just gave a series 5 to 6 different strategies for us to just wrap our mind around this, which is important. And I know that the conversation goes on, and hopefully we were able to inspire people to at least critically think about this, and not just accept resiliency as this state of mind, but also these actions that you can take to really make change happen in your life. And yeah, are we a resilient people? Sure, absolutely. There are ethnic groups who haven't gone through 25% of what Black Americans have gone through, and they're not here anymore. So yeah, there's something to say about us as a people, but we could be in a lot better position than what we are currently in, and and that just means that we have a lot more work to do individually and collectively, and hopefully we're all doing that part so our children have a better opportunity than what we have as adults. So with that, I don't know. I think we can wrap it up. Any final thoughts from you, Sam?
No, other than I want to, leave you with this quote: "No person is your friend who demands your silence or denies your right to grow." Alice Walker.
Mm. And on that, we will wrap it up for another installment of the Healing Brothers podcast. We'll be back next Sunday at 3 p.m. Central Time. Make sure you share the episode if you found it constructive, and make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. All that information will be in the description. And we'll see you next week. Take care. Peace.